It was a sweltering summer morning in Dale, Indiana, July 11, 2001. The kind of morning where the air feels still, the sun hangs softly over the rooftops, and the whole town moves slowly under the comfort of routine. But somewhere in that calm, footsteps broke the peace. A stranger, sweaty, barefoot, and carrying a knife, was moving through the quiet, closing in on a home where two teenage sisters were starting their day. Moments later, a scream ripped through the stillness, sharp, terrified, and gone too soon. The echo jolted the quiet streets of Dale awake. A frantic 911 call came in, muffled sobs, the sound of panic, the words every dispatcher dreads: "Someone's in the house. Please hurry." By the time officers arrived, it was too late. Inside that small home, they found horror beyond words. A scene so violent it would scar even the most seasoned investigators. Lying there was 15-year-old Stacy Payne, the kind of girl who lit up every room, who had plans, dreams, and a future. Her killer was still inside. His name, Roy Lee Ward. What began as a quiet summer morning would explode into one of Indiana's most haunting murder cases. A story of rage, evil, and the long, painful road to justice. So before we dive into this chilling case, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notification bell, because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that will keep you up at night. Stacy Payne was just 15, a bright, kind, and loving sophomore at Heritage Hills High School. She dreamed of becoming a teacher one day, a goal that matched her gentle heart and caring nature. Everyone in Dale, Indiana, knew her as the girl who always smiled, who helped her classmates, and who lit up every room she entered. She lived in a quiet home with her parents and younger sister, Melissa, in a small rural town where doors were left unlocked and safety was never questioned. Her bedroom reflected the innocence of teenage life. Band posters on the walls, schoolbooks neatly stacked, and a journal filled with dreams and doodles of the future she never got to see. On the morning of July 11, 2001, that peaceful life was shattered. What began as an ordinary summer morning turned into a tragedy that stunned the entire community. Stacy's home, once a place of laughter, became the scene of an unthinkable crime. The people of Dale were left heartbroken, struggling to comprehend how something so evil could happen to someone so pure. Stacy Payne's name would forever symbolize a young life stolen far too soon. Roy Lee Ward was 29 years old, a drifter with a troubled soul and a long history of poor choices that followed him wherever he went. To outsiders, he might have seemed like just another man down on his luck, but those who knew him understood there was something deeply unsettled beneath the surface. His early life was marked by instability, constant moves, broken family ties, and an upbringing surrounded by neglect and anger. From a young age, Ward struggled with authority, often clashing with teachers, family members, and the law. As a teenager, he began a pattern of rebellion and crime that would define his adult years. He spent time in juvenile facilities and later graduated to jails and prisons across several counties. His record grew longer with each passing year: burglary, assault, and sexual misconduct, crimes that revealed his inability to control his impulses. Ward's anger issues were well documented. He was known to explode over the smallest things, and his moods shifted without warning. By his 20s, he was living a rootless life, drifting from town to town, taking on temporary jobs, sleeping on couches or in cheap motels, and often depending on alcohol or drugs to dull his frustrations. Law enforcement officers across Indiana were familiar with his name. He had become a repeat offender, cycling through arrests and brief incarcerations that never seemed to change him. Ward's life had become a spiral, a pattern of bad decisions, violent tendencies, and wasted opportunities. Those who met him later described a man detached from empathy, hardened by years of failure, and incapable of forming genuine connections. He was always looking for his next fix, his next place to stay, his next moment of escape. In many ways, Roy Lee Ward's story was a reflection of a life lost long before his name ever reached the headlines. A man consumed by his own chaos, drifting aimlessly through the wreckage of choices he could never undo. It was a warm, quiet morning on July 11, 2001, the kind of summer day when life in Dale, Indiana, moved slowly and peacefully. The Payne sisters, 15-year-old Stacy and her 14-year-old sister Melissa, were at home while their parents were at work. The two girls were enjoying a typical day of summer break. No school, no rush, just the comfort of being home together. Stacy, the older sister, had been downstairs in the living room when there came an unexpected knock at the door around 9:30 a.m. Standing outside was Roy Lee Ward, a stranger to the family but familiar enough to the area to not raise instant alarm. He told Stacy he was looking for a lost dog, his tone calm and disarming, the kind of lie designed to lower someone's guard. What happened next unfolded in seconds. When Stacy opened the door to respond, Ward forced his way inside. Melissa, resting upstairs, was startled awake by the sound of her sister's terrified screams. She rushed to the top of the staircase and from there, saw a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Ward on top of Stacy, holding her down, his movements frantic and violent. The air was filled with screams, Stacy's desperate cries for help and Ward's chilling command, "You better be quiet." Panicked and trembling, Melissa ran to the phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she tried to describe what was happening. On the other end of the line, dispatchers could hear the chaos, Stacy's pleading, the thud of struggle, the horror unfolding in real time. Downstairs, the violence escalated. Ward had grabbed a nearby dumbbell, striking Stacy repeatedly with brutal force before pulling out a pocket knife. The attack was frenzied, merciless, and unrelenting. By the time police arrived, the front door was ajar, and the once peaceful home was a scene of carnage. Officers entered to find Ward still there, standing over Stacy's body, his hands, clothes, and face covered in blood. In one hand he still held the knife. He didn't flee. He didn't resist. As police ordered him to the ground, he muttered two words that chilled everyone in the room: "I'm sorry." Stacy was still breathing but only barely. Her injuries were catastrophic. Her throat had been slashed to the windpipe, her wrist nearly severed to the bone, and deep wounds covered her torso. Medical responders rushed to save her, but the damage was too severe. She passed away before help could arrive. Later forensic reports confirmed the depth of the horror. She had been sexually assaulted before the fatal wounds were inflicted. The small town of Dale, where violent crime was almost unheard of, was left reeling. The brutality of what happened inside that quiet home on that summer morning was almost impossible to comprehend. For Melissa, those moments would replay endlessly: her sister's screams, the sound of struggle, and the image of the man who had shattered their world forever. That morning, Dale lost its innocence. The Payne family lost their daughter. And Roy Lee Ward crossed the final line between a man with a troubled past and a monster beyond redemption. When police entered the Payne residence that morning, the evidence of violence was overwhelming. Every detail told a story of chaos, terror, and finality. But for investigators, what mattered most in the hours that followed was building an airtight case that could stand against any doubt. Forensic experts and detectives from multiple agencies quickly swarmed the scene. Cameras flashed, evidence markers lined the floor, and every surface was carefully examined. The murder weapon, a small pocket knife smeared with blood, was recovered only a few feet from Stacy's body. Nearby lay the dumbbell Ward had used in his initial assault. Both objects that would later become central pieces in the prosecution's case. Ward was taken into custody immediately. At the police station, still wearing the same blood-soaked clothes, he sat expressionless in the interrogation room. When questioned, he showed little emotion. His confession came easily, almost coldly, admitting that he had entered the home under false pretenses, claiming to search for a lost dog, and that when Stacy resisted his sexual advances, he lost control. Detectives would later describe the interview as one of the most chilling moments of their careers. One investigator recalled, "He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaken. It was like he was describing something that didn't even bother him." Forensic results left no room for doubt. DNA samples taken from Ward matched the biological evidence found on Stacy, confirming the assault and linking him irrefutably to the murder. Fingerprints, footprints, and even blood spatter patterns reinforced the timeline investigators had pieced together. It was as if every detail of the crime itself was determined to testify against him. The coroner's report further painted the brutality of the attack. Deep lacerations, multiple stab wounds, and defensive injuries showing Stacy had fought desperately for her life. The small town of Dale, unaccustomed to headlines of any kind, now found itself at the center of national attention. News vans parked along quiet streets, reporters interviewed tearful neighbors, and makeshift memorials began to appear in front of the Payne home. Candlelight vigils filled the evenings. Hundreds gathered, holding photos of Stacy, their faces lit by soft flickering light. People spoke her name in whispers, prayed for her family, and struggled to make sense of something that defied comprehension. For the investigators, it was a case they would never forget, not just because of the evidence but because of the innocence that had been stolen. As one detective later said, "We've seen a lot of crime scenes, but this was different. It wasn't just brutal, it was deeply personal, almost evil in its intent." By the time the evidence was processed, the confession recorded, and the forensic reports complete, there was no question in anyone's mind: the case against Roy Lee Ward was absolute. And as the town mourned, law enforcement prepared to take the next step, seeking justice for Stacy Payne. By early 2002, the case of State of Indiana versus Roy Lee Ward had become one of the most closely watched trials in the state's history. The evidence was clear, the details horrifying, and the grief in the courtroom was almost unbearable. The Payne family sat silently in the front row, their faces pale but resolute, as prosecutors laid out the facts of what had happened to their daughter Stacy. The jury listened to the crime scene photos, the 911 call, and the recorded confession, each piece of evidence hammering home the brutality of that July morning. Experts testified about the forensic findings, while investigators recounted Ward's calm, emotionless demeanor in the aftermath of the murder. Even seasoned officers admitted they had never seen such cruelty in their years of service. When the jury returned their verdict, it took only a few hours of deliberation. Roy Lee Ward was found guilty of murder, rape, and criminal deviant conduct. As the judge read the sentence, death, the courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobs of Stacy's family. For a brief moment, justice seemed to have been served. The community of Dale felt a sense of relief, believing that the man who had destroyed their peace would finally face the ultimate punishment. News outlets across the country reported the verdict, calling it swift and decisive. But the story was far from over. In 2004, just 2 years later, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned Ward's death sentence, not because he was found innocent, but because of a legal technicality that reignited outrage and heartbreak across the state. The court ruled that the intense media coverage surrounding the case had made it impossible for Ward to receive a fair and impartial trial in Spencer County. Nearly everyone in the community had already formed an opinion about him, and the court determined that pretrial publicity had compromised the jury's objectivity. For the Payne family, it was a devastating blow. The relief they had felt was ripped away in an instant. They were told they would have to endure another trial, another painful replay of the worst moments of their lives. Once again they would sit in that courtroom surrounded by reporters, lawyers, and strangers, forced to listen to every gruesome detail of how their daughter's life had been taken. Melissa Payne, Stacy's younger sister, who had been the one to call 911 that day, had to relive her trauma in testimony once more. Her voice trembled as she described what she saw, the sound of her sister's screams, the face of the man who had taken everything from her family. For the residents of Dale, the overturned conviction reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. The headlines returned, the crowds outside the courthouse reappeared, and the sense of closure vanished overnight. The retrial loomed over the town like a dark cloud. It wasn't just about punishment anymore, it was about endurance. For the Payne family, every hearing, every delay, every appeal felt like another cruel twist of the knife. They had already lost Stacy once. Now they were being asked to lose peace again and again in the name of due process. In the eyes of the law, the system was working as designed, protecting constitutional fairness. But for a grieving family and a shattered community, it felt like justice had been stolen. In 2007, 5 long years after the first verdict had been overturned, Roy Lee Ward once again stood before an Indiana courtroom. The same man, the same crime, but now in a different chapter of a story that seemed to have no end. The courtroom was tense, filled with the same haunting faces that had been there before. Investigators, journalists, and most painfully the Payne family who had sat through years of hearings, appeals, and delays just to arrive back at this moment. When Ward rose to speak, his voice was low, steady, and stripped of emotion as he entered his plea, guilty to the rape and murder of 15-year-old Stacy Payne. There were no drawn-out testimonies this time, no jury to persuade. The evidence was undeniable, and Ward himself no longer contested it. As the judge prepared to deliver sentencing, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy, the weight of 5 years of anguish pressing down on every soul in the room. The judge's voice was firm and deliberate as he described Ward's actions as cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of humanity. He spoke of the innocence of Stacy Payne, of the unimaginable suffering she endured, and of the irreparable loss inflicted upon her family and community. Then came the words everyone knew were coming but still struck with finality: the sentence of this court is death. Across the room, Stacy's family held hands tightly, tears streaming down their faces as they listened to the final judgment. For them this was not triumph, it was survival. Years of emotional exhaustion, court delays, and painful reminders had led to this single moment of resolution. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, capturing the raw reactions of those who had lived through the nightmare since that morning in 2001. In a trembling voice, Stacy's mother addressed the media. She was only 15. Her dreams, her future, gone. And for what? For nothing. Her words cut through the noise, echoing the heartbreak that no sentence could ever heal. Melissa, now older but still carrying the weight of that day, said quietly, "We'll never stop missing her. The pain doesn't go away, you just learn to carry it." Meanwhile, Ward's defense team pleaded for mercy, citing his long history of mental instability, substance abuse, and claims of remorse. They argued that his troubled upbringing and psychological issues diminished his capacity for control, painting him as a man broken long before the crime. But for the Payne family and for much of Indiana, those arguments rang hollow. Mental illness might explain a pattern of behavior, but it could never justify what he had done to Stacy. The judge, too, seemed unmoved by the defense's appeals. He noted that Ward's confession, while straightforward, lacked genuine emotion or understanding of the horror he caused. "He shows regret," the judge said, "but not remorse." And with that, the gavel fell once again, sentencing Roy Lee Ward to die for his crime. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of justice hung in the air. For the Payne family, it was another ending, not one that brought peace, but one that at least reaffirmed what they already knew, that the man who took Stacy's life would one day face the consequences. Yet even as they walked away, the reality remained: no sentence, no verdict, no punishment could ever fill the void left by a young girl whose life had been stolen far too soon. For over 2 decades, Roy Lee Ward has lived under the shadow of death within the heavily fortified Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, a place known for housing some of the most notorious inmates in the state. His days were spent inside a small, concrete cell where silence was broken only by the distant clang of metal doors and the echo of guards' footsteps. Time seemed to move differently there, slow, relentless, and heavy with anticipation. From the moment Ward arrived on Indiana's death row, his legal team launched an unending series of appeals, challenging every possible aspect of his sentence. They questioned the fairness of the trial, the constitutionality of the death penalty, and even the chemicals used in the lethal injection process. At times, it seemed like Ward's lawyers were fighting a losing battle, as one by one, each appeal was denied by higher courts who saw no justification for leniency. Meanwhile, the execution chamber at Michigan City sat unused, gathering dust. Indiana had not carried out an execution in more than 10 years, leaving Ward and others in a perpetual state of limbo, alive, yet waiting for death. But in early 2025, that uneasy stillness was shattered. News broke that the state had finally set an execution date for Roy Lee Ward. Television networks ran urgent updates, newspapers splashed his name across the front pages, and the small town of Dale, Indiana, where his crime had once shaken the community, fell silent once again. After more than 20 long years of legal wrangling, courtroom battles, and endless appeals, the message was clear: Roy Lee Ward's time on death row was finally coming to an end. As the sun set last night, few in Indiana slept easily. For more than 2 decades, the name Roy Lee Ward had been synonymous with horror, and today, October 10, 2025, that chapter finally closed. Inside the cold, stone walls of the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Ward spent his final hours in silence, awaiting the moment that had loomed over him since 2002. In the days leading up to his execution, Ward met with his attorneys, a spiritual advisor, and wrote a handful of letters to family members. He refused media interviews and turned down any last-minute appeals, saying through his attorney that he didn't want to cause the Payne family more pain. According to his spiritual advisor, Ward seemed remorseful in his final hours, calm but aware of the enormity of what he had done. He knew what he did was horrendous, the advisor said. He didn't deny it and he didn't run from it. His last meal, eaten quietly in his cell hours before midnight, was a large one. 1 hamburger, 1 steak melt, French fries, a baked potato with butter, 12 fried shrimp, 1 sweet potato, chicken Alfredo, and breadsticks. He finished nearly all of it and spoke very little afterward. Just after 12 a.m. Central Time, Ward was escorted into the small, sterile execution chamber. Witnesses described him as composed, his eyes forward, his expression solemn. When asked if he had any final words, he replied softly, "Brian is going to read them." His spiritual advisor bowed his head beside him as the injection began. At 12:33 a.m., according to the Indiana Department of Correction, Roy Lee Ward was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Outside the prison, the air was still and heavy. A few protesters stood silently, while members of the Payne family waited privately, finally seeing justice served after 24 long years. For them, it wasn't a moment of victory, just the quiet end to a nightmare that began on a summer morning in 2001, when a bright 15-year-old girl named Stacy Payne was taken from them forever. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe true justice was finally served today? Should someone who commits such a brutal act ever be allowed decades of appeals? Or do you think redemption, even for a man like Ward, is still possible? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on your notification bell so you never miss another true crime story that reveals the dark truths behind small-town America.